The door had been bricked over so carefully that for almost 100 years nobody in the congregation knew it had ever been a door. It sat behind the old iron furnace in the lowest room of a small stone church in the hills of eastern Tennessee, and when we finally worked out the last course of brick, the air that slid through the gap was cold and dry, and it smelled like turned earth and old iron. We were expecting a root cellar, maybe a forgotten coal store. What we found instead was a corridor. It ran straight into the side of the hill, lined floor to ceiling with cut stone, every block fitted so tightly against the one beside it that you could not have slipped a knife blade into the seam. We measured it that first night with a contractor's tape and a flashlight that kept flickering out on us. 200 feet. 200 feet of hand-cut stone running dead level into a mountain underneath a church that the county says was thrown together in 1891 by farmers who could barely afford the nails. That was where the questions started. Not the fun kind. The kind that keep you awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling. Before we go one single step further, I want you to do something for me. Drop one word in the comments right now. If you believe there is an ordinary, boring explanation for a 200-foot stone corridor buried under a country church, type the word built. If some quiet part of you already suspects that nobody was building anything down there, that somebody was covering up what was already inside that hill, type the word older. I read every comment on these videos, and I'm telling you right now, by the time we reach the end of this one, a lot of you are going to want to scroll back up and change your answer. So pick your word and keep it in your head. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, because the corridor is the last strange thing about this place. It is nowhere close to being the first. The church is called Hollow Rock Chapel, though hardly anybody calls it that out loud anymore. It stands on a shelf of flat ground about a third of the way up a ridge in the far eastern corner of Tennessee, where the mountains fold over on themselves so tightly that some of the hollows never see direct sun until nearly noon. If you drive up the gravel track that leads to it, you pass 2 collapsed homesteads and a family graveyard before the trees finally open and the building shows itself. Low and grey and far heavier looking than a chapel that size has any right to be. The walls are stone, not field stone stacked and mortared the way a hill farmer would have done it, but squared blocks, each one roughly the size of a footlocker, laid in even courses with joints so fine they read as a single unbroken surface from 30 feet away. The people who still meet there, and there are maybe 30 of them left on a good Sunday, will tell you their great-great-grandparents raised it with their own hands. The county record agrees with them. There is a deed. There is a line in an old survey book. Both of them say the exact same thing. Hollow Rock Chapel, raised 1891. But the people who built country churches in 1891 built them out of wood. Timber was cheap, it was everywhere, and it went up fast. A congregation of subsistence farmers living on corn and hogs and whatever they could shoot did not quarry, dress, and haul squared granite up the side of a mountain to build a chapel that seats 40. They did not have that kind of money. They did not have the tools for it. And more than anything else, they did not have a reason. Wood would have done the job. Wood did the job for every other church within 50 miles in every direction. Yet here sits Hollow Rock on its shelf of level ground, built like a strongbox out of stone that matches no local quarry anybody has ever managed to point me toward. That is the first thing that does not add up, and it is a small thing on its own. You can wave it away without much effort. Maybe there was a stonemason in one of the families. Maybe there was a seam of good rock nearby that got worked out and forgotten. People have handed me both of those explanations over the last 2 years, and I have written both of them down in my notebook because they are reasonable and one of them might even be correct. But I want you to hold on to the feeling of that small wrongness, that little itch at the back of the neck, because it is going to happen again, and again. And each time it happens, the ordinary explanation is going to have to stretch a little bit further than it did the time before. I came to Hollow Rock the way I come to most of these places, which is to say a stranger emailed me. His name was Dell. He was somewhere north of 70, and he had been the unofficial caretaker of the chapel for most of his adult life. He mowed the yard. The roof stayed patched under his hand. He kept the furnace running through the mountain winters so the pipes in the little kitchen would not freeze and split. And that furnace was the whole reason he wrote to me, because the furnace was dying, and replacing it meant clearing out the lowest room of the church, and clearing out that room meant finally moving a heavy wooden shelving unit that had been bolted to the back wall since before Dell was born. Nobody living remembered what was behind it. Nobody had ever thought to ask. It was just the wall. It had always been the wall. When Dell and his nephew finally unbolted that shelving and dragged it aside, they did not find bare stone like they expected. They found brick. A rectangle of old red brick, maybe 7 feet tall and 3 feet wide, set into the stone wall in a way that did not match anything else in the building. The chapel was granite. This one patch, hidden for a century behind a shelf, was brick. And brick, Dell knew, is what you use when you are closing something up in a hurry. He could have left it alone. Anybody sensible would have. But Dell had lived his whole life inside the small mystery of that heavy building, and he told me later that some part of him had always known there was something the church was sitting on top of. So he tapped it, and it did not sound like a wall with dirt behind it. It sounded hollow. It sounded like there was a room back there, or worse, that there was no back there at all, just open black space running off into the dark. That is when he stopped, and put the shelf back the way it had been, and sat with it for 3 days, and then wrote to a total stranger on the internet because he did not trust himself to open it alone. I drove down the following weekend with a camera, a respirator, and every intention of debunking the whole thing before lunch. I have opened a lot of walls that turned out to be nothing, old coal chutes, filled-in doorways, cisterns. I fully expected Hollow Rock to be another one of those, another afternoon of dust and disappointment, and I want you to remember that, because I am not somebody who came to this place wanting it to be strange. I came wanting it to be ordinary. It refused. We opened the bricks slowly, one course at a time, from the top down, so that whatever was behind it would not come rushing out at us all at once. The mortar was soft and old, and it gave up the bricks almost without a fight. And with the very first gap, before we could even see anything, we felt the air. Cold air, steady air, moving. Not the stale trapped air of a sealed room, which sits and does nothing. This air was moving, slow and constant, the way air moves when it has somewhere to go, when it is connected to a space far bigger than the one you are standing in. Dell felt it before I did. He had one hand flat against the brick, and he pulled it back like the stone had bitten him, and he looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. You have to understand that this man had spent 50 years believing he knew every inch of that building. He knew where the water got in during a hard rain. He knew which floorboard in the sanctuary had a soft spot. And in one afternoon the church he thought he understood had turned into something with a hidden lung, breathing slow and steady out of a wall that was never supposed to be a wall. We stood there in the low room, and we listened to it breathe. I knelt down at the gap we had opened, and I put the lantern up to it, and the light went in and kept going, and did not come back the way light does in a small room. It just travelled, out and away, into a dark that had depth to it, real depth, the kind you feel in your chest before your eyes can confirm it. And I remember thinking, in that exact moment, about the deed I had photographed at the courthouse the week before, about the tidy little line in the survey book that said this church was raised in 1891 by local hands, because whatever the lantern light was falling into on the other side of that brick was not 1891. It was not any year a clerk had ever written down. And the gap between what the record claimed and what my own eyes were telling me had just become a canyon. Before we move on to the stonework itself, stop for a second. What you just heard about the corridor behind that sealed cellar door is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the county's own building record. 200 feet. The missing decade. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. We took out the rest of the brick with our hands, and when the last of it came away, the light from Dell's lantern did not find a back wall. It found a passage. A throat of dressed stone, wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side, tall enough that neither of us had to stoop, running level and straight and dead into the heart of the ridge. The floor was flagged with the same tight-fitted stone as the walls. There was no mud, no rubble, no fallen ceiling. It looked less like something dug into a mountain and more like something the mountain had been poured around. And it went back so far that our lantern light simply gave up somewhere in the middle of it and let the darkness have the rest. We did not go in that first night. I want to be honest about that, because I know how it sounds. We stood at the mouth of a 200-foot corridor that nobody had walked through in 100 years, and we chose to go home and sleep on it. Part of that was air quality, because you do not walk into a sealed space without knowing what you are breathing, and part of it was simple animal caution. But most of it, if I am being truthful, was the stone. Because once you got close enough to actually look at the walls of that passage, the small wrongness I told you about earlier stopped being small. Let me try to describe what we were looking at. The blocks that make up the corridor are not the same blocks that make up the church above it. The church, the part built in 1891, is good work. It is careful, honest, 19th century masonry. And if you run your hand along it, you can feel the tool marks, the little ridges and chatter left by a chisel and a mason's patient arm. Every block up there tells you a human being shaped it. You can practically hear the hammer. But the blocks down in the corridor do not tell you that. They do not tell you anything. Their faces are smooth, in a way that stone does not get on its own, smooth the way a river takes 10,000 years to make a pebble, except these are flat planes and hard right angles, and they meet each other with a precision that a river could never manage. There are no tool marks. None. Not a chisel scar, not a drill hole, not the ghost of a saw. The surfaces look poured, or melted, or grown, and I know how that sounds. I am going to keep saying that throughout this video, because I refuse to pretend the words coming out of my mouth are normal words. They are not. Now here is where I have to be fair, because being fair is the only thing that makes any of this worth listening to. There are ordinary explanations for smooth, tightly fitted stone, and I chase down every one of them before I let myself think anything stranger. The first is skilled masonry. Human beings have been cutting stone to astonishing tolerances for a very long time, and there are cathedral walls and cut granite docks all over the world where the joints are almost invisible. So that is on the table. The second explanation is water and time. Given enough centuries, moving water will polish a stone surface glass smooth. The third is a facing technique, a plaster or a poured stucco skin laid over rougher stone to give it that seamless look. Every one of those is a real thing that really happens. I did not dismiss any of them. I want that on the record. But each of those explanations wants something from the site that the site refuses to give. Skilled masonry leaves tool marks, and there are no tool marks. Water polishing needs flowing water, and this corridor is bone dry and has clearly been dry for a very long time, with no channel, no staining, no mineral crust where water would have run. And the facing skin theory falls apart the moment you get down on your knees at a joint, because there is no skin. We checked. We ran a blade along the seams looking for the edge of a plaster layer, and there is no layer. The smoothness is not a coating on the stone. The smoothness is the stone. It goes all the way down. Whatever made these blocks made them smooth to the core, and then set them together so precisely that 100 years of a mountain settling on top of them has not opened a single crack. I brought a mason with me on the second trip. A real one, a man who has spent 40 years laying stone, and who does restoration work on historic buildings. Exactly the kind of skeptical, unromantic professional you want standing next to you when your imagination is starting to run. I did not tell him anything in advance. I just walked him down to the brick, now fully removed, and I let him look. And I watched a man who has touched more old stone than almost anyone alive go quiet in a way I had not seen a person go quiet before. He put his hand on the wall. Then he lowered his cheek almost against it to sight down the joint line. He took out his own knife and tried the seam himself, the same thing we had done, because he did not believe us. And then he stood up and he said something I have thought about every day since. He said, "I do not know who did this, but they were not us. And I do not mean the farmers, I mean us, masons. Nobody I have ever heard of works stone like this. The joints are the thing that undoes people. When two blocks of stone meet in normal construction, there is a gap, and you fill that gap with mortar, and the mortar is what holds the wall together and keeps the weather out. That is how it has always been done. Because stone is heavy and stubborn, and cutting two faces flat enough to touch across their whole surface is nearly impossible by hand, but in the corridor there is no mortar. There is no gap for mortar to go into. The blocks are simply against each other, face to face, so completely that in a lot of places you cannot even find the seam by eye and have to feel for it with a fingernail. And when you do find it, it does not run straight. It jogs. One block will have a slight bulge, a soft curve, and the block beside it will have the exact matching hollow so that they lock together like two puzzle pieces cut from the same cloud. That is not something you do by accident. That is not something you do quickly. And it is not something you do to a root cellar under a 40-seat country church. There is a name for this in the world of unexplained architecture, and the name is polygonal masonry. You find it at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where stones the size of cars are fitted together with those same impossible curving joints and no mortar. There is more of it in the old walls of Cusco. You find it in Japan, in Egypt, in Italy, in places separated by whole oceans and thousands of years, done by people who supposedly never met and never shared a single tool. The mainstream position, and I will state it plainly and fairly, is that these are independent achievements of skilled, ancient labour, that human beings, in many places, figured out how to fit stone this well because human beings are clever and patient and had a lot of time. That is a serious position held by serious people, and I am not going to mock it. But I will tell you what it felt like to stand in that corridor in the hills of Tennessee, thousands of miles and an entire ocean away from Peru, and to see the same curving, mortarless joints, the same tool-free surfaces, the same locking puzzle stones, in a place where the official story is that corn farmers built a chapel out of whatever was lying around. It felt like finding a fingerprint, the same fingerprint, in two places it has no business being. And that is the question that started to eat at me, standing down there with a professional mason who had gone pale next to me. Not who built the church. We know who built the church. The church is the easy part. The question is what the church was built on top of. Because more and more, it did not look like the corridor belonged to the chapel at all. It looked like the chapel was the newcomer. It looked like somebody in 1891 had climbed this ridge, found this stone throat already here, already ancient, already going 200 feet into solid rock, and had done the only thing frightened people know how to do with something they cannot explain. They built a house of worship on top of it. And then, at some point, they bricked it shut and told no one. Before I left the corridor that second day, I did one thing I am still not sure I should have done. I took a sample, not from the door, I would not touch the door, but from a spot low on the wall, where a single small flake of the stone had already worked loose over the century, sitting on the floor waiting for someone to pick it up. I told myself that made it acceptable, that I was taking something the corridor had already given up rather than breaking a piece away, and maybe that is just a story I told myself to feel better. Either way, I put that flake in a bag, and I carried it out, and I sent it to a lab that does mineral analysis for people who are not supposed to ask too many questions about where a sample came from. The results took a long time to come back, and when they did, they were the kind of results that answer nothing and open 3 new doors for everyone they close. The stone is real stone. I want to say that first, because a certain kind of story wants the answer to be that it was some unknown material, some impossible metal alloy that science cannot name, and that is not what came back. It came back as a dense, fine-grained, igneous rock, closest in composition to certain granites, which is unremarkable. What was remarkable was everything around that plain fact. The density was too high, at the top edge of what that kind of rock can be, and slightly past it. The grain was too uniform, with almost none of the natural variation you find in stone that cooled in the earth the ordinary way, as if it had been formed under conditions far more controlled than a mountain provides. And there was no weathering rind, no chemical skin of age on the sample at all, which for stone that has supposedly sat exposed in a mountain for an unknown number of centuries makes very little sense, because everything ages, everything develops a rind, and this had none. The lab technician who called me about it was careful with her words, the way people get careful when they are professionally embarrassed by their own data. She said the sample behaved, in a couple of the tests, more like a manufactured ceramic than a natural rock with cum. Not that it was one, just that it behaved like one, in its uniformity, in its density, in the clean way it fractured. And then she asked me the question they all eventually ask, where did you get this? And I gave her the honest and useless answer, which is that I got it off the floor of a corridor that is not supposed to exist, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said she did not want to know any more than that, and I understood, because by then I did not blame anyone for not wanting to know more than they had to. I have to be fair about this too, the same as I have tried to be fair about everything. A slightly too dense, slightly too uniform granite with no weathering rind is not proof of a lost civilization. It is a strange sample. Strange samples happen. Rock forms under a huge range of conditions, and now and then it forms in a way that surprises a lab, and there is a version of this where the stone is simply an unusual natural formation that early people found already smooth and already dense and quarried and fitted with enormous skill. That version exists, and I hold it in my hand alongside all the others. But I will tell you that when I put the lab report down next to the mason who said they were not us, and next to the toolless joints, and next to a door that turns a compass, the ordinary version got a little harder to hold, the way it always did, one more small weight on a scale that had been tipping the same direction since the night we first felt that cold air move. So I went looking for the paper, because if somebody built a stone corridor into a mountain, even 1,000 years ago, and even if the record of it is thin, there is almost always a trace, a land grant, a tax note, a survey mark, a story that got written down by a preacher or a schoolteacher or a census taker passing through. Stone that precise does not appear on a hillside without leaving a ripple somewhere in the human record, and I have learned to trust the paper trail more than I trust my own eyes, because my eyes want the story to be strange and the paper does not care what I want. The county courthouse for that part of Tennessee is a 2-hour drive from the chapel, and I spent the better part of a week in its basement, which is where the old records live, in acid-stained boxes under a single buzzing light. I found the deed for the church land easily enough. It transfers a parcel of hillside to a group of trustees in the spring of 1890 for the stated purpose of building a place of worship. Ordinary, clean. The trustees are named, and I was able to trace some of them forward to descendants and back to their own parents, and they are exactly who the church says they are. Local farming families. Nobody with money. Nobody with engineering behind them. So far the paper agrees with the plain story. But then I went looking for what was on that parcel before 1890, and that is where the record does something I did not expect. It stops, not gradually. It stops the way a road stops at a cliff. The chain of title for that specific piece of ground runs backward, owner to owner, the way these things do, until you reach the 1870s, and then there is a gap, a blank. The parcel simply is not accounted for in the county books for a stretch of about 10 years, roughly the back half of the 1860s and the front of the 70s, and when it reappears with a note in the margin that I have now read more times than I can count. The note says, "In the cramped hand of some long-dead clerk, records reconstructed following the courthouse fire." There it is, the 10-year gap, the one I asked you to keep in your head when we started, and I want to be careful here, because a courthouse fire is one of the most ordinary things in the world. County courthouses burned constantly in the 1800s. They were wooden, they were lit by open flame, they were full of paper, and half the counties in the American South lost their early records to fire at some point. So a note about a fire is not, by itself, proof of anything at all. It is the single most boring explanation for a gap in the record that exists, and if the fire were the only strange thing, I would not be telling you about it. The problem is what the reconstructed records do and do not contain. When a courthouse burned and the county rebuilt its books, they did it by going back to the people. They would call in the landowners and the neighbours, and they would recertify who owned what based on memory and on whatever private deeds people had kept in their own homes. And that process leaves a very particular fingerprint. It leaves human names. It leaves the residue of people standing in a room swearing that, yes, this is my land, and my father held it before me, and here is the neighbour who will vouch for it. The reconstructed record for the ridge has none of that. The parcel just reappears, already owned, already surveyed, with no reconstruction testimony attached to it at all, as if somebody quietly wrote it back into the books without ever asking a living soul what had been there before. And there is one more thing in that box, and it is the thing that made me sit down on the cold basement floor and just breathe for a minute. Filed loose, not bound into any ledger, was a single sheet of a much older survey. It is water damaged and it is torn along one edge, and most of it is illegible. But you can make out a portion of the ridge, drawn in a careful old hand, and on the ridge, at very close to the spot where Hollow Rock Chapel now stands, somebody has drawn a small rectangle and written beside it a single word. The word is not chapel, because there was no chapel yet. The word, as near as 3 people who are better at old handwriting than I am can make it out, is magazine, which in the language of that era does not mean a thing you read. It means a store, a vault, a place where something is kept. Something was being kept in this hill before the church was ever dreamed of, a thing worth surveying, something worth labelling on a map as a place of storage, up on a hard-to-reach ridge, miles from anywhere, in a spot that no rational person would choose to store anything you actually wanted to use. And then a fire conveniently erases the decade on either side of it, and the land goes quiet. And 30 years later a congregation of farmers appears and builds a granite church directly on top of the exact spot, and bricks up the only way in. I do not know what was in the magazine. I want to say that clearly, because the honest answer is that I do not know, and the paper will not tell me. Maybe it was gunpowder, because magazine can mean a powder store, and there was a war in those years, and armies did hide caches in the hills. That is the mainstream reading, and it is a good one, and it might be right. But a powder magazine is a shed. It is a small, dry room. It is not 200 feet of mortarless polygonal stone running dead level into bedrock with joints like fitted clouds and not a single tool mark on any surface. Nobody hides gunpowder inside the work of a vanished civilization. They hide gunpowder in a shed. The corridor was already old when whatever hid the powder found it, if powder is even what it was, and they used it the way we always use these places. As a container for something small and temporary and human, tucked inside something enormous and ancient that they did not build and did not understand and, in the end, decided to seal away and forget. Let me come back up out of the courthouse basement and back to the church itself, because there is something about the building that I noticed on the very first day and did not understand until the paper trail forced me to look again. The lowest room of Hollow Rock, the furnace room where the brick door was hiding, is below ground. That is not unusual on its own. Plenty of buildings on a slope have a lower level dug into the hill. But when you stand in that room and you look at the walls, you start to see things that a basement is not supposed to have. There are windows down there. Real windows, framed in stone, complete with sills and lintels, the whole apparatus of an opening meant to let in light and air. And every one of them is buried. They open onto packed earth. You look through the glass, where there is still glass, and you see dirt pressed right up against the pane. Now think about what that means for a second. Nobody builds a window to look at dirt. A window is an opening to the outside, to the sky, to the light. If a room has finished stone windows and those windows now open onto solid packed earth, then there is only one explanation that makes any sense. That room was not always underground. It used to be above the surface. It used to have light and air coming through those windows, which means the ground outside used to be far lower than it is today. Something raised the level of the earth around this building by an entire story. The church did not sink. The ground rose, and it rose enough to swallow a full floor of a stone building and press dirt right up against windows that were designed to look out at the world. This is the part of the story where I have to introduce an idea that a lot of you already know and a lot of you are hearing for the first time, and I am going to try to present it the way I present everything, which is carefully and without asking you to believe more than the evidence in front of us actually supports. There is a body of research, and it lives well outside the mainstream, that argues this exact pattern shows up all over the world. Buildings, especially old grand stone buildings, whose ground floors and even second floors are buried below the modern street level. Windows at ankle height. Doorways you have to duck down into. Whole first stories functioning as basements that were plainly never designed to be basements. The people who study this call the event that caused it a mud flood. The idea is that at some point, and the timing is argued about endlessly, a vast quantity of earth and sediment moved across the landscape and buried the lower levels of an older, more advanced built world, and that what we call history is in large part the story of the survivors digging out, resettling the tops of buried buildings, and forgetting what was underneath. I know, I know how that sounds, and I want to have the ordinary explanation its full and fair hearing, because it deserves one, and because you deserve to make up your own mind. Mainstream archaeology has a perfectly reasonable answer for buried ground floors, and the answer is that cities rise over time. It is called the accumulation of occupation layers. People build, things fall down, new people build on top of the rubble, dust and trash and debris pile up year after year, and over centuries the ground level of an inhabited place genuinely does climb, sometimes by many feet. Rome is famously built on top of older Rome. This is real. This happens. And for a city, over 1,000 years, it is a complete explanation. But Hollow Rock is not a city. It is a single church on a bare ridge in the mountains, with almost nobody living around it, in a place with no centuries of dense settlement stacking rubble against its walls. There is no occupation layer here, because there was no occupation. There were a few dozen farmers and a lot of trees. So when I stand in that furnace room and look at a finished stone window with dirt jammed against the glass, the slow accumulation of a busy city over 1,000 years cannot be my answer, because there was never a busy city, and there were never 1,000 years of it. Whatever buried the lower floor of this building did it fast, and it did it in an empty place, and it did it long enough ago that by the time the farmers arrived in the 1800s, the buried level was already down there, already sealed. Already a mystery they inherited rather than made. The farmers did not bury this floor. They found it buried, and they built their little chapel on the exposed top of a structure that was already mostly underground when they got here. Which brings us, finally, to the walk. On the third day, with a meter that told us the air was safe, and a pair of good lights, and a rope tied off at the mouth in case the floor was not as solid as it looked, we went in. I have been in a lot of tight, dark, old places, and every one of them has a feeling, a personality almost, and most of them feel dead. Caves feel dead. Old mines feel dead. This did not feel dead. The corridor was cold and it was silent, and the air moved past our faces the whole way, that same slow, steady exhale, and the deeper we went, the more the sound of our own footsteps changed, because the stone was so tightly fitted and so hard that there was no give in it anywhere, no soft earth to soak up the noise. And every step came back at us, flat and sharp, like we were walking inside a bell that had not yet been struck. We counted our paces. The walls stayed perfect the entire way, the same curving mortarless joints, the same toolless faces, never once breaking into rough rock or natural cave, which is its own kind of impossible when you think about it. Because 200 feet is a very long way to hold a tunnel through a mountain without ever hitting a fault or a soft seam or a place where the rock fought back. It was as if the corridor did not care what the mountain was made of. As if the mountain had been made to accommodate the corridor, and not the other way around. And about 160 feet in, our lights finally caught the far end. It was not a dead end of fallen rubble, not a natural chamber either. It was a wall. A finished wall of the same fitted stone, closing off the corridor, and set into the middle of that wall, waiting for us in the dark exactly the way the brick had waited behind Dell's shelf for 100 years, was a door. The door was not made of stone, and that alone was enough to stop us where we stood. Everything else about that corridor was stone, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the far wall it was set into, all of it the same seamless fitted rock. But the door itself was metal, dark, dull and heavy-looking, a single slab of it filling a frame that had been cut into the stone so cleanly that the metal and the rock met with the same hairline precision as everything else down there. It had no handle. It had no visible hinge. There was no lock we could find, no keyhole, no mechanism, nothing that told us how it was meant to open or which way it was meant to swing. It was just a flat, dark face of metal standing at the end of 160 feet of impossible stone, and it had a temperature. I put my palm against it, and it was cold, colder than the stone around it, cold in a way that felt less like the chill of a cave and more like the metal was drawing the warmth out of my hand and into whatever was on the other side. There were marks on it. I need to describe these carefully, because this is the point in the story where I know I lose some of you, and I understand why, and I would rather lose you honestly than keep you with an exaggeration. The marks were not writing, at least not any writing I recognized, and I have spent enough time around old inscriptions to recognize a good many. They were not English, not Latin, not Greek, not Cyrillic, Not any of the runic alphabets, not Cherokee, which would have made a certain sense this deep in these particular mountains. They were geometric. Lines and arcs, and a repeating figure that looked something like an 8-pointed star inside a circle, cut into the metal with the same toolless smoothness as the stone, so that they did not look engraved so much as they looked like they had always been part of the surface, the way a vein is part of a leaf. And around the central figure, running in a band, was a sequence of smaller shapes, evenly spaced, clearly deliberate, clearly meaning something to somebody, that told us absolutely nothing. I photographed all of it. I want to say that, because the first thing people ask is whether there is proof, and the honest answer about the marks is that yes, there are photographs, and no, the photographs do not settle anything, because a photograph of a symbol nobody can read is just a photograph of a mystery. I have shown those images to people who study old scripts for a living. One of them told me it reminded him of certain alchemical diagrams from the late medieval period. Another told me it looked like nothing human at all and asked me, only half joking, where I had really taken the picture. A third looked at it for a long time and then handed my phone back and did not want to talk about it anymore and would not tell me why, and I have learned not to push people when they get that look. We did not open the door. I need you to hear that clearly, and I need you to sit with why, because I think the why matters more than almost anything else in this whole account. We stood in front of a sealed metal door at the end of a corridor that should not exist, covered in symbols that nobody could read, cold to the touch, with air moving steadily past us toward it and through some gap we could not see. And every instinct I have as a person who chases these stories for a living was screaming at me to find a way through it. And I looked at Dell, who was 70-some years old and had gone the colour of ash, and Dell said the only thing that any of us said in that whole span of minutes. He said, "They closed the church over it for a reason." And I realized, standing there, that I did not actually want to know what the reason was. Not that badly. Not that night. Some doors you can walk away from and still sleep, and some doors, once you open them, you never sleep again, and I did not know which kind that was then, and I decided I did not need to find out to tell the story true. So we backed out. We walked the 200 feet in reverse, slower than we had come in, none of us willing to be the last one, all of us listening to that bell's sharp echo of our own retreating feet. And we came up out of the furnace room into the ordinary electric light of a Tuesday evening, and we sat in Dell's truck in the churchyard for a long time without turning the key. And that is where I started asking the old people. Because if a thing has been sitting under a community for 100 years, sealed and silent, the community remembers it. Not in the records got burned, but in the stories. The stories always survive, passed down at kitchen tables and on front porches, worn smooth and strange by 100 years of retelling, and if you know how to ask, the old people will give them to you. An old woman named Ruth, who is the oldest living member of the congregation and who was born in a cabin further up the same ridge, told me that when she was a small girl her grandmother would not let the children play on the north side of the church. Not because it was dangerous in any way you could point to, just because that was the rule, handed down from her own grandmother, who had helped build the place. You did not play on the north side, and you did not press your ear to the stone in the low room, and you did not, under any circumstances, go looking for the old door. Ruth said she did not even know what the old door was. It was just a phrase, a warning with the meaning worn off it, the kind of thing a family says for so many generations that the reason dissolves and only the fear is left. Do not go looking for the old door. She had been told it her whole life, and she had never once, in more than 90 years, gone down into that low room to find out what it meant. She did not want to. Some part of her, the same part that lives in all of us, already knew. Another old man, Carl, told me something I have not been able to shake. He said his father, who was a boy when the church was still fairly new, claimed there had been more of the metal doors once, not just the one at the end. He said the original builders, the 1891 congregation, had found several openings when they cleared the ridge, several throats going into the hill at different points, and that they had spent the better part of a year not building the church, but sealing the other ways in, walling them up with the granite they cut before they ever laid the first course of the chapel itself. According to Carl, the church was not the reason they came to the ridge. The church was the lid. They built a house of God on the one door they could not fully close, so that people would gather there and sing there, and keep the ground consecrated and watched over, and never, ever go down. I want to widen the frame now, because a single strange church on a single ridge in Tennessee is a curiosity, and you could file it away as a local oddity and move on with your life. But Hollow Rock is not alone, and that is the part that turns a curiosity into something that keeps me driving these mountain roads year after year. Once I knew what to look for, I started finding the pattern everywhere, and the pattern is always the same. An old stone structure that is far too good for the people who supposedly built it, a lower level that is buried when it was clearly designed to be above ground, a gap in the records right where the answers should be, and a story, always a story, passed down among the oldest families, warning the young not to go looking for something underneath. There is a term that gets used for the older world these structures seem to belong to, and the term is Tartaria. I use it carefully, because it means different things to different people, and it carries a lot of noise along with it. In the plain historical sense, Tartaria was simply the old European name for the vast stretch of Central and Northern Asia, a region on old maps that later mapmakers quietly erased. But the word has come to stand for something bigger. It has come to stand for the idea that there was once a single, advanced, worldwide civilization, one that built in stone to a standard we cannot match today, that harnessed forces we have forgotten, and that was wiped from the record by some combination of catastrophe and deliberate erasure, its buildings buried, its history rewritten, its survivors folded into a much smaller and much younger story that we now call the only history there ever was. The mainstream view, and I will always give it to you straight, is that Tartaria in this larger sense is a myth, a modern misreading of old maps and old architecture, and that every star, fort and buried basement and mismatched church has a mundane explanation if you are willing to do the boring work of looking it up. I have done a lot of that boring work. Sometimes the mundane explanation holds, and sometimes, like at Hollow Rock, it does not, and it does not, and it does not, no matter how many times you ask it to. Take the star forts, since I mentioned them. All across the world, on nearly every continent, there are fortifications built in the shape of perfect geometric stars, with angled bastions radiating out in flawless symmetry. The official explanation is military, that the star shape was an ingenious response to the invention of the cannon, that the angled walls deflected cannon fire and eliminated blind spots, and that is a genuinely clever piece of reasoning, and it is taught in every military history course. But there are far more of these star forts than any reasonable amount of warfare can account for, tucked into remote corners of the earth where no cannon was ever fired, built to a level of geometric precision that has nothing to do with stopping a cannonball, sharing a single global design language among peoples who supposedly had no contact with one another, the same fingerprint again, the same impossible precision, the same worldwide reach, the same official story that explains the surface and cannot touch the depth. And when I stood in the corridor under Hollow Rock and looked at that 8-pointed star cut into the cold metal door, I thought about the star forts, and I did not think it was a coincidence, and I still do not. Here is the thesis, laid out as plainly as I can lay it, and then you can decide for yourself, because that is the only honest way to end a story like this one. The thesis is that the world we were handed is not the first world, that there was an earlier one, older and in some ways greater, that built in stone the way we build in steel, that raised structures whose lower halves are now buried beneath our feet in 10,000 towns and churches and forts, and that this earlier world came to an end in an event, or a series of events, that buried it, drowned it, reset it, and that the people who came after, our own recent ancestors, the farmers and settlers and builders of the last few centuries, inherited a landscape littered with the bones of that older world. Sometimes they lived on top of them, sometimes they built on top of them, and sometimes, when they found a door they could not explain, cold to the touch and marked with symbols they could not read, they did the only sane thing frightened people can do. They covered it up. Over it they raised a church. They made a rule that the children were not to go looking, and they let the reason dissolve into a warning, and the warning dissolve into a habit, until all that remained was an old woman on a ridge telling me she never went into the low room and could not have told me why. I cannot prove that thesis to you. I want to be completely clear about that at the end, the same way I tried to be clear all the way through. I do not have the older world in a box. What I have is a 200-foot corridor of mortarless, toolless, polygonal stone under a church that farmers supposedly built out of scraps. I have windows in a basement that were made to look at the sky and now look at packed dirt. I have a 10-year hole in the county record, papered over with a courthouse fire. I have a survey sheet that calls the ridge a magazine before there was ever a chapel. I have a metal door with a star on it that draws the warmth out of your hand. And I have the memory of a whole community, worn down to a single sentence that a grandmother passed to a granddaughter across 100 years. Do not go looking for the old door. Every one of those things has an ordinary explanation. I have given you every ordinary explanation I could find, fairly, because you deserve them. But you have to hold all of them in your two hands at the same time. And when you do, when you hold the mason who said they were not us, and the buried windows, and the burned decade, and the magazine, and the cold metal star, all of it at once, the ordinary explanations start to feel less like answers and more like bricks. Bricks laid one course at a time over a door that somebody, a long time ago, decided the rest of us were better off never opening. I told myself I was done after that first descent. I told myself I would write it up, show the photographs, lay out the paper trail, and let the corridor be somebody else's problem. That lasted about 2 months. Because the thing about a door you chose not to open is that it does not stay closed in your mind. It opens over and over, every night, in the space right before sleep, and you find yourself lying awake building theories about what the cold on the other side of it might be. So I went back. This time I brought more people, and I brought instruments, because I had learned my lesson about walking into these places, relying on nothing but a flashlight and my own nerve. We brought air monitors, because the moving air still bothered me. Air that moves has to come from somewhere and go to somewhere, and a sealed corridor with a solid metal door at the end should not have a steady draft, and yet it did, and the draft always ran the same direction, from the church end toward the door, as if the door itself, or the space behind it, was very slowly and very patiently breathing in. The monitors confirmed what our faces had told us. There was a real and constant flow of air, small but unmistakable, disappearing into the frame of that metal door through a gap too fine for us to see, which means there is space behind it. Real space, connected to somewhere, big enough to swallow a current of air day after day, year after year, for however long that door has stood there. It is not a slab bolted against solid rock. It is a lid on a volume, and the volume is large, and the volume is not sealed as perfectly as the people who made it might have hoped, because it is still exchanging air with the world, still faintly connected to us, one thin breath at a time. We brought a compass, and this is the part I have gone back and forth about including, because I know exactly how it sounds, and I know that a compass can be thrown off by ordinary iron, and there is a metal door right there, and metal doors have iron in them, and iron deflects a compass, full stop, no mystery required. I want that stated plainly before I tell you what happened, so that you have the ordinary explanation in hand before the strange one arrives. What happened is that the compass did not simply deflect toward the door, which is what a large iron mass would make it do. It turned, slowly, steadily, all the way around, one full rotation and then another, the way a compass behaves when it cannot find a stable field to lock onto, when whatever is around it is not a single fixed mass of iron, but something changing, something in motion. It spun for the entire time we stood in front of the door, and when we walked back up the corridor it slowed and steadied, and by the time we reached the furnace room it pointed north again like nothing had happened. A stationary iron door does not do that. A stationary iron door pulls the needle and holds it. Whatever is behind that door was not holding still. We brought a thermal camera, and the thermal camera is what finally broke the last of my composure. Through the lens, the stone corridor read exactly as you would expect, a uniform cold, the even chill of deep rock that has not seen the sun in 100 years. But the door did not read as one temperature. The door had a pattern on it. Not the symbols we could see with our eyes, but a different pattern underneath. Warmer lines and cooler lines threading across the metal in a lattice, faint but absolutely there, shifting so slowly that you only caught it if you watched the screen for minutes at a time. Cold objects do not have moving heat patterns. Dead objects do not have moving heat patterns. There was something on the other side of that metal, or within it, that was warm in places and cool in others, and the warm places moved. I have watched the footage 100 times. I have shown it to an engineer who works with industrial thermal imaging and asked her to tell me it was an artifact of the camera, a reflection, a calibration error, anything ordinary, and I watched her face while she watched the screen, and she did not tell me any of those things. She asked me, very quietly, whether we had opened it, and I told her no, and she said, "Good." We stayed longer that second trip, long enough to notice that the light behaved strangely near the door, that our beams seemed to reach it and then stop, not reflecting the way light bounces off a normal metal surface, but sinking in and not coming back, so that the door always looked slightly further away than it actually was, and slightly darker than the darkness around it. Long enough to notice that sound behaved strangely too, that when you spoke in front of the door, your own voice came back to you a fraction of a second too late and a fraction of a tone too low, as if the space that returned it to you was larger and deeper than the corridor you were standing in. And long enough, finally, for one member of our group, a calm and skeptical man who had spent the whole trip gently teasing the rest of us for being spooked, to go completely silent and set down his equipment and say that he wanted to leave, now, and that he was not going to explain why, and that he would wait for us in the truck. We found him there an hour later, and he never came back to the site again, and to this day he will not talk about what he felt in front of that door in the last few minutes before he walked out. I have stopped asking him. Some of these stories are not mine to pull out of people. They belong to whoever felt them, and if a grown man wants to carry a thing in silence, I have learned to let him. There is a recording. I made it on the second trip, standing about 10 feet back from the metal door with a good directional microphone, and I have listened to it more times than is probably healthy. For the first several minutes it is exactly what you would expect. Our breathing, the scuff of a boot, the small electronic hiss of the recorder itself, and then, at a point I can find without looking any more, the background changes. It is not a voice. I want to be careful here, because the easy thing, the thing that gets clicks, would be to tell you we captured a voice, and we did not. What we captured was a tone. A low, steady, single note that rises up underneath everything else, sits there for the better part of a minute, and then fades back down into nothing. It is faint. You have to turn it up. But once you have heard it, you cannot unhear it, and every person I have played it for has gone still at the same moment without me pointing it out, which is not what usually happens with random noise. I took that recording to a man who works in acoustics, and I took the tunnel's dimensions to him too, and I asked him what a space like that would do to sound. He told me that a long, hard, walled, precisely dimensioned stone corridor is essentially a musical instrument, that it has a resonant frequency, a note it wants to sing, set by its length and its shape, and that if anything at all is exciting that space, even a slow current of air slipping through a gap in a door, the corridor will pick out its own note and hold it. The tone on my recording, he said, was consistent with the resonance of a space very close to the dimensions I had given him, which is either the most reassuring thing anyone told me in 2 years, because it means the note is only physics, only a stone flute breathing in the dark, or it is the least reassuring thing anyone told me, because it means the corridor was cut to a length and a shape that makes it sing, and somebody chose that length, and somebody chose that shape. I do not know why you would tune a tunnel unless you wanted it to be heard. And then there was the geologist. I carried the bearing and the measurements to a man who has spent his whole career reading the bones of these mountains, and I asked him one plain question. Could you drive a 200-foot corridor, dead straight and dead level, through this particular ridge, and never once hit a fault, a soft seam, a shift in the rock that forced you to curve? He laughed at first. Then he looked at the survey I had made, and the laugh went out of him. He explained that Appalachian rock is old and tortured and folded, riddled with faults and sudden changes of hardness, and that boring a perfectly straight and level passage through it without deviation would defeat modern tunneling equipment, let alone anything a 19th century farmer could put his hands on, let alone whatever came before them. Nature does not open a hole like that, he said, and we cannot open a hole like that, not here, not that straight, not without the rock telling us where it would rather the tunnel go. He handed the survey back to me, and he did not offer a third possibility, and I did not ask him for one, because I could see he did not have it, and I did not want to watch a serious man reach for one and come up with nothing the way I had. The question I kept circling back to was the builders, not the ancient ones, the ones who made the corridor, because I had given up hoping to ever put a face or a name to them. I mean the 1891 congregation, the farmers who found this thing and chose to build over it, because whatever they knew it first hand. They stood where I stood. They saw the door before it had a church on top of it. And if I could find even a scrap of what they thought they were doing, I would be closer to the truth than any survey sheet could take me. So I went looking for them the way I went looking for the land, through the paper, through the descendants, through the family Bibles that mountain people keep and treasure and fill with birth dates and death dates in the margins. Most of the trail was cold, but one family, the descendants of a man who had been something between a lay preacher and a foreman on the church construction, still had his papers. Not a diary exactly. A ledger, the kind a careful man kept to track expenses and labour, water-stained and mouse-chewed, and mostly concerned with the price of lime and the wages of the men who hauled stone. Ordinary, tedious, precious, and folded into the back of it, in the same hand, but written faster, messier, the way a man writes when he is not keeping accounts but unburdening himself, were 3 pages that had nothing to do with lime or wages at all. I am not going to read them to you word for word, partly out of respect for the family that trusted me with them, and partly because the man's spelling and phrasing take some untangling. But I will tell you what he wrote, plainly, and you can weigh it however you choose. He wrote that the ground on the ridge was wrong. Those were close to his words. That when they came to clear it for the church, they found openings, more than one, and that the openings were not caves, and were not mines, and were not made by any hand the men could recognize. He wrote that they went into one of them and found the stone throat and the cold at the end of it, and that 2 of the men who went furthest in came out changed, and that one of them left the county within the month and never came back, and the other was never quite right again. He wrote that the congregation prayed on it for many nights, and that the decision they reached, which he clearly believed was the only decision, was to close the ground, to seal every opening they had found with cut stone, and to build the house of worship over the deepest one, the one they could not fully close, so that the presence of God and the gathering of the faithful would hold down whatever was below. And then he wrote a line that I have copied into my own notebook and read so many times the ink has started to smear. He wrote that they were not the first to close it. He wrote that when they cleared the brush from the main opening, they found it had already been sealed once before, long ago, with stonework older than any of them, and that their work was not to shut a door that had been standing open, but to shut again a door that someone before them had already shut, and that had, in the years or the centuries between, come open on its own. Sit with that for a moment, because I have had to. The farmers of 1891 were not the discoverers of the corridor. They were the second sealing. Somebody had closed that door before them, with stonework that was already ancient by the time 19th century farmers laid eyes on it, and in the gap between the 2 ceilings, the door had opened again. Not been opened on its own. And whatever that meant to the men standing on the ridge with their hauling ropes and their fear of God, it was enough to make them stop building a church, spend a year walling up a hillside, and then hand their children a warning stripped of everything but the dread. Do not go looking for the old door. Now you know why the sentence survived when the reason did not. The reason was too much to carry. The warning was all they could bear to pass down. I tried to find the names of the 2 men who went furthest in, the one who fled and the one who was never right. The ledger names most of the workers, dozens of them, in its accounting of wages. But there is a page torn out. One page, torn cleanly from the labour accounts, right where the alphabetical run of surnames would have covered a particular stretch, and it is the only page missing from the entire book. Somebody, at some point, decided that 2 names in particular should not survive, and removed them, and left the rest. Whether it was the foreman himself, sparing the families, or someone after him, I cannot say. But the pattern by now was so familiar it barely surprised me. A record that stops exactly where the answer should be. A fire, a torn page, a gap, a silence. Every single time I got close enough to touch a name, a date, a face, a fact that would turn the corridor from a mystery into a piece of documented history, the record was already gone, and gone in a way that looked less like accident and more like someone reaching back through time to close a door I was trying to open. The descendants let me keep a copy of the 3 pages. The original stays with them, and I think that is right. Before I left, the woman who had shown them to me, the great-great-granddaughter of the foreman, asked me if I had gone down there myself, into the corridor, all the way to the end. I told her I had. She asked if I had opened the door. I told her no, and she nodded, slowly. The same slow nod that Ruth had given me and Dell had given me, the nod of people who come from a long line of those who learned to leave a thing closed. And she said, "My grandmother used to say the church was not built to bring anyone closer to heaven. She said it was built to keep something from climbing up out of the ground." I always thought that was just an old woman being dramatic. She looked at me then, and I have not forgotten it. She said, "You have been down there. You tell me." Was she being dramatic? And I could not answer her. I still cannot. There is one more piece, and it is the piece that took me the longest to understand, because it required me to stop looking at the corridor as a thing in itself and start looking at where it was aimed. A corridor is a line. It has a direction. And a line that runs 200 feet dead level and dead straight into a mountain is pointing at something, the way a rifle barrel points at something, whether or not you know what is at the far end. So I took a bearing. I stood at the mouth of the corridor with a good compass, the one that had spun in front of the door but held steady up here, and I sighted down the passage, and I wrote down the direction it ran. And then I went home and I put that bearing on a map, and I drew the line out, and I followed it. It does not point at anything you would expect. Not at the nearest town, or the river, or the old road, or any of the ordinary human things. It points, if you extend it far enough, at another ridge, 11 miles away, where according to the county records there is nothing at all, just forest. But I have learned that where the records say nothing, that is exactly where you should go, and so I went, and I walked that second ridge for 2 days, and near the point where my line crossed it I found a depression in the ground, a rectangular sink in the earth choked with laurel and a century of leaf litter, with the tops of cut stones just breaking the surface at its edges. I did not dig. I did not have the right, and I did not have the nerve, and honestly, I did not need to. I knew what it was. It was another opening, another throat into another hill, sealed and sunken and forgotten, lying exactly on the line that the hollow rock corridor pointed toward. The 2 of them are connected. Not by tunnel, necessarily, though I cannot rule that out, connected by intention, by a geometry laid down across the landscape by someone who thought in straight lines 11 miles long, and who placed these things where they placed them for reasons that were surely as clear to them as they are dark to us. That is when the scale of it finally landed on me, and it is the reason I am able to stand here and talk about a single church in Tennessee as if it matters to you, wherever you are watching this from. Because if Hollow Rock is one node on a line, and the second ridge is another, then the line does not stop at 2. Lines do not. And I began, carefully, quietly, not wanting to sound like the very thing I am always trying not to sound like, to look for the rest of the pattern across these mountains. The Appalachians are old, older than bone, older than almost any range on earth, and they are full of places where the official history goes thin and the local stories go strange. Sealed mines that were never mines. Church foundations too deep and too fine for the congregations that sit on them. Whole hollows that families quietly moved away from generations ago and will not say why. Cut stone breaking the surface in the middle of nowhere, on nobody's land, in the path of nobody's road. I am not going to lay the whole map out tonight, because a lot of it is still just lines on my wall, connected by string, and I promised you at the start that I would be careful, and I am trying to keep that promise even now. At the end, when it would be so easy to let the string on my wall become a certainty in my mouth. It is not a certainty, it is a pattern, but it is a pattern that keeps drawing straight. Let me try to say the honest thing about what all of this might mean, and then let me get out of your way and let you decide. The mainstream frame would tell you that I have assembled a scrapbook of unrelated ordinary things and stitched them into a story with my own anxiety for thread, a skilled mason from somewhere, a powder magazine, a courthouse fire like 1,000 other courthouse fires, a basement that flooded and silted up, an iron door that fools a compass, a superstitious mountain family, and a torn page that a mouse could have taken, each thing alone, ordinary. And the mainstream frame is not stupid, and it is not lying to you, and on any single one of these points it might well be right. I have said that at every turn, and I say it again here, because the day I stop saying it is the day I stop deserving your trust. But there is another frame, and it is the one I cannot fully shake, no matter how many nights I try to reason my way out of it. In that frame, what sits under Hollow Rock Chapel is a fragment of the older world, a piece of the thing that was here before our history started, built by hands and methods we lost or never had, buried by whatever ended that world, and inherited by frightened farmers who did the only thing they could, which was to seal it and consecrate the ground and pass down a warning until the warning was all that was left. In that frame, the corridor is not a root cellar and not a magazine. It is a corridor, and it goes somewhere. It was made to go somewhere, by someone, for a reason, and the door at the end of it is cold and marked and breathing, and it has opened once already, on its own, in the dark, with no hand upon it. I do not know which frame is true. I have spent 2 years of my life at the mouth of that corridor, and I still do not know, and I have made my peace with the not knowing, or I tell myself I have. What I know for certain is small, and it is solid, and I will leave you with only that. There is a stone corridor 200 feet long under a country church in Tennessee. It should not be there. The people who built the church did not build it, and said so, and said they were only the second ones to close it. There is a metal door at the end that draws the warmth out of your hand and turns a compass in slow circles. And there is an old woman on that ridge, and a foreman 100 years dead, and a family 100 miles away, all of them handing down the same worn sentence across all that time, the same warning stripped of its reason. Do not go looking for the old door. We found it anyway, and we chose, in the end, to leave it closed, and to brick the church back up behind us, and to tell you about it instead. So now the choice is partly yours, because you know it is there now, and knowing a thing is there is the first step of going to look for it. I would ask you not to, but I know something about people who chase old doors. I am one of them, and I know that asking never works.